All right, Alexander, let's once again discuss what's going on between China and Australia. And things are going from bad to worse. Instead of calming things down, it looks like it's deteriorating. So I'm reading a headline from Zero Hedge, and the title says China indefinitely, and that's in quotes, indefinitely suspends economic dialogue with Australia as relations continue to deteriorate. So we've got the Chinese response, I believe, to what General Findlay, I believe was his name, General Findlay of Australia, his leaked comments that surfaced. And I think we're starting to get the Chinese retaliation in a way. Is that correct?
Absolutely, that's exactly what we are. But can I just say, what is really extraordinary about all of this, and has been so pretty much from the outset, the whole Australian-Chinese, this collapse of relations, is that it seems to me that it's the Chinese who are driving it. I don't know whether they really have grasped the fact that it's their actions that are pushing this very fast. But if you dial back a couple of years when, people in Australia started to talk about China, and it was about the time that Donald Trump was talking about China. But Australia is a very close ally of the United States. It couldn't, at that time, would have been politically impossible for Australia to speak out against US policy, especially when, a lot of Australians share it. But that did not need, it seems to me, to lead to the collapse in relations between China and Australia, which we are now seeing. But for every Australian move, and, we talked about what that general said in another video, and he said some very strong things, but they were only in the end words. For every action of that nature, you see the Chinese reacting in the most forceful way. And they've just done so again. And it's as if they're trying to push Australia into a corner and to tell the Australians, look, we are the big people, the big guy in this neighbourhood. You take us on, even in the smallest way, at, enormous risk to yourself. And, of course, Australia is not going to buy that because it can't and it won't. But it's deteriorating this relationship between China and Australia, which I would have expected it would be in China's interests to want to preserve. We hear an awful lot about Chinese aggressiveness. We hear an awful lot about Chinese wolf warrior diplomacy. I find that in many ways and in many places, this is overstated. I think Australia actually is something of the exception. I'm not quite sure why the Chinese are taking the Australians on like this, why they're being so tough with Australia, but it seems to me that they are. And given that Australia was so important to them, I wonder what has changed to make them to decide that it's not important in the same way anymore.
I was reading an article the other day, and it was highlighting Xi's, and I remember the title said Xi's plan to take on the Five Eyes. It was something along those lines, and I'll try to find it and pull it up. But I'm pulling up articles from the BBC and from Reuters, which are basically saying how the Five Eyes are starting to sound more about get more involved in human rights as a group, as a collective. But New Zealand is getting very uncomfortable with that stance, and they're not aligning with the Five Eyes, and we're starting to see a little bit of a break in the solidarity of the Five Eyes, at least in the way it's approaching China. New Zealand kind of takes a stance that, the Five Eyes really shouldn't weigh in on those types of issues. And the article focused on Xi's kind of chess game mentality of trying to dismantle the Five Eyes, piece by piece, one by one. Do you think there's something there in his stance towards Australia, saying, once again, we go back to our previous video on this, saying, once again, this is my window to break apart the Five Eyes, to break apart the this Western infrastructure that has surrounded the South China Sea, for example, and that has ruled the world for the better part of say, the fall of the Soviet Union for the better part of, 20, 30 years. Do you think that there's some calculus in Xi's geopolitical gameplay here with this?
I've no doubt of it. I am absolutely sure that the Chinese know exactly what they're doing. And if they've decided to come down so hard on Australia, it's for a purpose. And you're quite right, it's already apparently alarming New Zealand, which doesn't want to be exposed to the same kind of pressure that Australia is coming under. And that's presumably why the Chinese are doing it. And it's working. I mean, from that point of view, New Zealand, as you rightly say, is beginning to become nervous and deterred, even as Australia feels the extraordinary pressure. But it is an indication also of how the balance is shifting. And I said that, why was it that the Chinese seem to be so willing to rip up this relationship with Australia? And actually, there is one reason, one obvious reason why the Chinese feel able to do something which they weren't willing to do a few years ago. And that is, if you look at the kind of things that Australia exports, grain, strategic minerals, those sort of things, 10 years ago, China needed Australia to supply them. Now it's forging this very close relationship with another country that is able to supply all those minerals and all that food and all that grain in even bigger quantities. And that, of course, is Russia. There's an article in the Daily Telegraph by a British commentator called Mark Armand, who made precisely that point. And his words were, Russia's providing China a strategic hinterland stuffed with the natural resources Beijing's economy needs. And that's, I think, what the Chinese have done. They've leveraged Russia's problems with the West to bind the Russians to themselves. And now they're turning on countries like the Five Eyes states, like Australia and New Zealand, and they're by pushing so hard on Australia, they are frightening New Zealand, and they're starting to create divisions within the Five Eyes. And that, it seems to me, is what the game plan is. But it's really quite extraordinary to watch. And I have to say, as somebody who has, certain regard for Australia, I feel for them there. I mean, this is really something which perhaps they never anticipated or expected that they'd ever find themselves in.
Yeah, but you could also say this is part of the geopolitical game. When you form alliances, this is part of how things shift in the geopolitical landscape. Once again, we always have to look back to the shift from Trump to Biden. With that shift from Trump to Biden, a lot of things changed. And yeah, that you could say, absolutely, they changed inside the United States. But on a geopolitical level, we're starting to see the ripple effects of those changes, and they are leading to Australia as well. Australia is now in the middle of a very turbulent Chinese chess game.
That's absolutely correct, because, of course, the counterplay, which you might have expected from the US, isn't coming, because the US itself is so disorganized at the moment. So, the US is not actually coming to Australia's support. It takes Australia's support for granted, but it isn't really working with Australia to any great degree. It isn't mitigating the effect on Australia. It's not talking up its support for Australia. It uses Australia. It draws Australia into arrangements against China, like the so-called Quad, of which Australia is a part, along with Japan, the United States, and India. But when the Chinese then turn on Australia in response, in retaliation, if you will, Australia stands exposed. And because the Chinese detect that weakness in Washington, that lack of, firmness in Washington. They feel able to do it, and they sense it's working. As you rightly said, New Zealand, which is, the other country of the Five Eyes in the Pacific, is becoming increasingly nervous about what's happening.
All right, so let's end the video with this from once again from Zero Hedge. I found the article. It says China is trying to break up the Five Eyes intelligence network. That's the article's title. And here's an excerpt. The Five Eyes alliance, compromising the US, Canada, Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, dates back to the Second World War, when a number of key allies decided to share intelligence in their bid to defeat Nazi Germany and Japan. And this is in bold. The survival of the alliance in its current form, though, is under threat after Ms. Ardern's administration announced that it was making improved trade relations with Beijing its priority, rather than maintaining its support for the Five Eyes. So my question to you is this. I find this really interesting, and I don't know if New Zealand will be able to hold this line with its stance vis-a-vis its other Five Eyes partners. But once again, on the geopolitical chessboard, it looks like New Zealand is kind of saying, you know what? Given the situation in the US administration and the way things have changed, we need to, play a little chess. We need to make some different moves, perhaps. And it looks like that's what they're doing with regards to how they're going to deal with China vis-a-vis their other Five Eyes partners. Should Australia start considering the same types of chess moves? Not the same as New Zealand's, for example, but once again, start to say, we need to start exploring different options here, because the reality of the situation is things have changed, and we're looking at New Zealand and they're exploring options. They're breaking away from the solidarity of the other Five Eyes nations. At least that's how it looks. Once again, I'm not going to say if it's going to hold or not. Maybe it doesn't hold. But right now, it looks like you may have some Five Eyes countries that are saying things have changed on the ground and we need to start moving our pieces a little differently.
I think the important thing to understand, the key point to understand about the Five Eyes, is that it is the core American alliance. I mean, there's NATO, obviously. There's also the US relationship with Japan. But the inner ring of US allies are the countries that, taken together, form the Five Eyes. They are the English-speaking countries, closest politically to the United States. They're the countries that share intelligence with each other, which is always the most sensitive thing. I mean, Germany, for example, does not share intelligence in the routine way that the Five Eyes states do. The Five Eyes almost operate as a single intelligence bloc. So if the Chinese can crack the Five Eyes, then they have cracked the entire US alliance system, because the whole thing will then start to splinter. Even other parts of it, like NATO and the relationship with countries like Japan and South Korea, will start to suffer, because the US itself, its underlying underpinning in geopolitical terms, will have splintered. And I think that is exactly what is happening. Now, it's important to say this. I cannot imagine any other point since the Second World War where a country like New Zealand, a country, a member of the Five Eyes, would be taking a position so different from that of the United States on a major geopolitical issue. Up to now, they all work together in unison as one, especially in terms of dealing with the adversary power. So obviously you'd have times in the past where leaders like, say, Harold Macmillan in Britain, or Pierre Trudeau, the father of Justin Trudeau, would say, well, let's talk to the Russians in a little bit more emollient way than the US was doing at that time. But ultimately and always, they always followed the same policies, the same group of policies. New Zealand at the moment is at least considering its options to go differently. If New Zealand cracks, and I'm not saying it will, but as I said, we've never come to this close to it, this close to that point before. If New Zealand cracks, then I can easily see Australia saying to itself, look, why should we take all that punishment for on the US's behalf? The US isn't standing by us, and New Zealand is going its own way. Perhaps we should consider doing what New Zealand also is doing. And yes, I agree. I think initially New Zealand is hedging. It's trying to gain leverage. It's saying to the US, don't take us for granted. We're still loyal to you, but we are ultimately loyal to you. But, you know, if you press us too hard, well, we do have other options. I don't think anyone in New Zealand at the moment is looking to break with the Five Eyes. But when that kind of game gets played, over time, if Washington proves unresponsive, that may happen. And it may happen in Australia too. And we discussed in a recent video how if it is not very careful, the United States could find that its entire position in the Indo-Pacific region will start to break down and break down very rapidly. Even core allies like New Zealand and Australia mending their fences with the rising power, which is Beijing, and with a knock-on effect on the US's entire alliance system everywhere else, including in Europe, including with Japan, including with all other countries. So again, this isn't a good time to be asleep at the wheel, as I rather get the impression is the case at the moment in Washington.
Yeah, and I go back to that Alaska meeting and the way China humiliated Blinken, and I just think to myself, you know, he is testing the solidarity and the resolve of the Five Eyes, of the European Union, of the whole Atlantic structure. And, you know, he's clever. He's clever, and I think he's poking around, he's testing things, he's bending things, and sooner or later he's going to find those spots where he could, you know, capitalize on his strategy, on his geopolitical strategy.
I entirely agree. I think you're absolutely right. I think that if things go on as they are in Washington, now I don't see them changing, by the way. I don't see any sign of things getting better there. But if things go on as they are in Washington, then of course he will gain. Because my impression is that the political leadership in Washington, to the extent that it exists at all, is totally absorbed with internal American things. It's not really looking at the situation in the Pacific region. It's drifting, and it's drifting in ways that are both reckless in terms of commitments being made to places like Taiwan, which I think the US ought to be much more careful in what it says about Taiwan, but it's also reckless in that it's not minding its own alliances properly. And Australia, at the moment, is the victim. It's finding itself under intense pressure from China, which is growing almost by the month.
And you know, elections have consequences, and we'll end it on this note. Elections definitely have consequences, and the consequences of losing Trump and moving to Biden, I think, are going to be felt. I mean, we're only 4 months into this. We're only 4 months into a Biden-Harris administration, and look at what's going on.
Absolutely.
I mean, countries around the world, there's going to be a lot of consequences for what happened on November 3rd, 2020. A lot of geopolitical consequences in ways that I think even we couldn't have imagined.
Yeah, no, this is quite true. And can I just say, it's also often a symptom of what happens in great powers when they start to their position starts to crack and go downward. You see the people, the leaders at the center of power, they become completely absorbed with their own intrigues and their own infighting and their own political games. They are very, very hostile to anybody, any person from outside the inner ring, coming from outside it and trying to reform things, trying to change and turn things round. So they gang up on him, making, real change and real policy impossible. And in the meantime, as they continue with their own infighting and their own intrigues, everything around them starts increasingly fast to break down. And they just don't know what to do because, one, they cancel each other out, and two, most of them are not that bright to start with. So that's a sign, if you like. It's a symptom of a system in decay. I'm sorry to say that, but it's true. If you want historical examples of this, you will find them in all sorts of places. You will find them, in the last days of Rome, in the fall of the Ming Empire in China, in the crises that took place in many countries, in the Habsburg Empire, in the Tsarist Empire. It's always that way. People who come in wanting to carry out, deep structural change get resisted and pushed aside and demonized, and in the process, the collapse becomes inevitable and comes incredibly fast.
Yeah, it is moving fast. Like I said, we're four or 5 months into this, and look at what's going on. It's incredible.
I know. I agree.
All right. We'll leave it there. I'll put a code, guys, for the Duran shop. Real News. Use that code at checkout. You get 10% off all the merchandise. I'll put that down in the description box. And also look for us on Locals, on Super U, and on Odyssey. 3 new platforms where we are digging deep into, and you guys are going to find a lot of good stuff on those platforms. So make sure you check us out there. I will pin those in the comment section. I'll actually put them in the comment section, and I'll pin it up top so you can find us there as well. Take care.